My fiance's brother texted me the night before the wedding, "You deserve better. Ask her about Vegas." I did. She froze. And that's when her maid of honor stood up and said, "You didn't tell him?" The sentence itself felt like a verdict when it arrived by text at 1:12 a.m. The kind of late-night punctuation that turns a life you thought steady into an unsolved puzzle. I read it 3 times, thumb hovering over the screen, trying to locate the courage to call him back. Tyler had always been blunt in a way I admired. Bluntness meant loyalty, or so I'd told myself when we first became friends and later lovers. But in the quiet of my apartment, all I could hear was the tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of the city, and the text became louder than any noise outside. "You deserve better. Ask her about Vegas." He didn't sign off. He didn't add a smiley or an apology. He sent a single accusation wrapped in concern and left the rest for me to unwrap. The engagement had been months in the making. Ella had said yes on a rainy rooftop in October, laughing as the rain painted the city with sudden light. She kissed me with both hands tight on my face as though fastening me into her life. We had argued only about names for our future dog and whether to merge our Christmas traditions. The wedding had been planned to the letter. Candles, linen in a shade that made her eyes greener, my mother's nervous instructions for the seating chart, invitations stamped and sent and sent. I had stood in front of mirrors and rehearsed the vows until the words weren't mine anymore, but muscle memory. I loved Ella, and I had spent the last year arranging our world to make that love safer. Premarital counseling sessions, a checking account we called ours, a condo that smelled faintly of her coffee. Yet Tyler's text, who knew him better than anyone. Not me. He was her brother, her childhood co-conspirator, the one who had seen her in braces and then in a gown for prom, the one who always knew better than I did whether a decision sounded like her or like someone who had borrowed her voice. So I called him, expecting the gruff half-laugh that meant he had been overprotective again. Instead, Tyler's silence filled the line for a long beat before he said, "Don't do anything tonight, just be careful, man." His voice was unsteady. When I asked plainly what he meant, he didn't answer. He asked instead if I remembered how Ella used to get a ring pop at the fair and hide it in her pocket like treasure. He sounded like the child who had tried to reassure himself with stories. "Please," he said finally, "ask her. Ask about Vegas." The word Vegas arrived with the weight of a secret someone else had been carrying because they couldn't bear to tell both of us at once. I thought of the last time we had all been together, laughter, too much wine, the maid of honor, Claire, making a joke about spontaneous decisions, and I wondered whether the joke had been surgical, precise enough to hide an incision. The next afternoon, under the fluorescent light of the bridal suite, I found myself alone with Ella, while the makeup artist fussed with false lashes and the seamstress pinned the gown at the back like an invisible caretaker. My questions were small at first, like picking lint off an expensive sleeve, but then I stopped pretending my hands were not shaking. "Ella," I said, trying to make my voice sound like the voice that had sung her to sleep on a train ride to Boston. "Tyler texted me last night. He said to ask you about Vegas." Her reaction was nothing like what I had rehearsed in my head. She didn't cry. She didn't deny. She froze, the way water does at the edge of a pond when wind hesitates. Her eyes went to the mirror and didn't see me. They saw a past version of herself or a version she had been keeping locked in a drawer. The room, which had been full of chatter and the rustle of silk, pulled the air out of my lungs. When I reached for her hand, it hovered between us as if the skin itself had become a membrane, holding back a secret. The maid of honor, Claire, Ella's oldest friend, who had been with her through bad haircuts, first heartbreaks, and the slow ache of patience, caught the strain in the room and stood up abruptly from the chaise where she'd been applying perfume. She had been quiet that morning, serene in a way that had always felt like a harbor. Her voice, when it broke this silence, was not theatrical. "You didn't tell him," she said, and the question landed like a pebble that rippled across everyone. Heads turned toward her as if expecting thunder to follow. Ella's stare sharpened and dulled. She had the look of someone who had been found mid-step during a tightrope walk. The whole wedding party recoiled a fraction. Weddings are built on rehearsed reactions, not surprises. But the room that had been set for celebration suddenly felt like a courtroom, and Ella looked, in that moment, like a defendant and a victim both. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she drew air like Ella always did, deep and slow, then told us a story in fragments. A bachelorette weekend 2 summers earlier, a night in Vegas she had promised herself she'd keep secret. A mistake made with a stranger in a hotel lobby bar. A choice that hadn't felt like her until the consequences wrapped around her like ivy. She spoke in a voice that was both soft and trembling, as though the words themselves were shards she had to handle carefully. Claire's face shifted as she listened, from astonishment to a kind of fierce protectiveness. She reached across and squeezed Ella's shoulder, whispering a truth only the two of them had shared before. Ella hadn't meant to hurt me. It was one night, Ella said. It wasn't love. It wasn't planned. It was awful and tiny, and it's been in me like a splinter since. I felt as though the floor dissolved beneath me. Betrayal isn't a single thing. It's a geometry of small acts that, when stacked, make a structure you didn't recognize. For the first time I saw Ella not as the person I had built my future with, but as someone who had a private history that could change the coordinates of our life. Tyler had texted with the bluntness of someone trying to stop a car before it hit the light. Claire's interjection, "You didn't tell him," wasn't the recrimination I expected. It was the honest astonishment of someone who had been keeping pieces of a friend at bay and suddenly saw how those pieces might collide with another life. There was a hush that followed, then a flood. Whispered confessions, explanations, the way fear of losing someone turns into clumsy attempts to keep them from discovering more. Ella tried to show me the letter she had written the night after Vegas. A letter she had folded and then never mailed. Words intended for herself. Admissions soaked in shame. Promises to be better, please to forget. Please to forget. Her hands trembled so that the paper flapped like a wounded bird. She apologized in ways that were at once specific and general. "I'm sorry for the secret. I'm sorry I lied by omission. I'm sorry I hurt you." Phrases that were meant to mend and simultaneously expose the rawness of what she had withheld. Tyler watched me, jaw tight, his presence both an accusation and a bomb. He had always been the one to set the boundary lines between them and the world. And here he was, having crossed a line of his own by sharing the secret with me. I had expected anger, but his eyes were only tired, as if he'd as if he'd been awake too many nights imagining the wedding day that could become rubble. Claire sat down again slowly, the movement like someone exhaling after holding breath too long. "We wanted to tell you," she said to me, her voice small, "but we didn't want to take away your choice." The logic was suffocating in its protectiveness, another pair of hands trying to shelter me from the heat of a truth. "You deserve to decide," she added, and in that sentence the responsibility was placed at my feet like a package I hadn't asked for but could not refuse. What followed was not a neat unspooling of blame. It was the messy work of humans trying to reconcile different truths. Ella said she had ended it on the cab ride back to the hotel, that she had gone home alone and vowed to bury the mistake in the kind of secrecy that ends up defining you if you let it. She had told Claire because Claire had been at her side in the aftermath, and Claire, out of loyalty or fear, had kept the secret between them. But secrets have a peculiar economy. They compound interest with time, and one tiny slip can bring them out in violent clarity. Tyler's conscience found its voice the night he couldn't sleep and sent me the text as a preventive measure. "Better a blunt warning than silence," he later said, because if the wedding happened under a lie, he couldn't be complicit. As the minutes folded into hours, the bridal suite became a confessional and a battlefield, the seamstress pausing her work to listen, the makeup artist dabbing at her own eyes. The decision we had to make, whether to keep the wedding on or to call it off, wasn't binary. It was a spectrum of what it meant to trust someone, to let them carry your future, and to accept the risks that come with intimacy. For me, the sting was not simply infidelity. It was omission, the way a secret could grow roots under the surface of someone you thought you knew completely. Love had never seemed less naive. It felt like a choice weighted and deliberate. The manner where we planned to say vows would be set in 2 days' time. Chairs would be arranged, and the florist would have already ordered the peonies. Canceling would be a public unraveling, an admission of failure in a world where success is measured in staged smiles and curated photos. But going ahead felt like accepting a life whose foundation had been partially hollowed out. So I asked questions, practical, brutal, compassionate, the kind that test not only the truth of a story but the character of a person telling it. When had it happened? Who was the other person? Was there anything ongoing? Ella answered each with a weary honesty that both hurt and healed in equal measure. It had been a single night, as she had said, with someone she could not name because it felt pointless to drag a third party into our moral storm. There had been no ongoing relationship. She had not cheated on me in the month since. Instead, she had carried the secret like contraband. As I listened, anger rose and subsided in quick tides. Anger at the deceit, but also at my own expectations of perfection, at the idea that love is a transparent thing devoid of stain. I felt betrayed, yes, but I also felt the old warm connection. Ella's laugh in the car when we got lost on a road trip, the way she hummed while cooking, the small domestic rituals that had become our scaffolding. I didn't know which of these things should win. Claire's face, meanwhile, had shifted from steel to sorrow. She confessed to me quietly that she had kept the secret because she thought she was protecting Ella from consequences. She didn't deserve to suffer. Especially from me. I didn't think you'd look at her and see her after, she said, the word after a lungful of grief. I thought you'd see who she is now. Her confession admitted a separate betrayal, not of our relationship, but of my right to make an informed choice. Tyler, who had remained in the wings, explained that he couldn't let a marriage begin under a fundamental untruth. His intervention had been clumsy, but he believed that the truth should be a foundation, not an afterthought. He had sent me the text in the way people act when they're trying to avert a catastrophe they can almost see, with panic and blunt honesty. That night, alone later, Ella and I sat in the dim kitchen of our apartment, 2 plates of untouched pasta cooling at our elbows. We didn't fight in the way a movie does, no shouting, no doors slamming. Instead, we spoke in the flat, exhausted prose of people who understand that the future is now negotiable. I don't want to lose you, she said, and in that sentence every vulnerability lay stark and shining. But I can't live with a guilt that will eventually sour into resentment, I replied. Our conversation was honest enough to be painful. We talked about forgiveness, what it looked like, what it demanded. Forgiveness is not a unilateral gift. It is an agreement to accept complexity and to rebuild trust through action, not just promises. We set conditions, full transparency going forward, counseling sessions starting immediately, time to mourn what we had imagined our marriage would be without this shadow. The decision to postpone the wedding was mutual. It was a choice that felt like failure and courage at the same time. At the same time. We called our families and our vendors, and with each phone call the world shifted a little. My mother cried softly and then said, "As long as you're sure," which is another way of saying she trusted me to know what to do. Ella's parents were quieter, not because they didn't feel, but because they had always had a different way of processing. Practical, concerned for logistics, worried about how to support their daughter. The news rippled through our circle, and then slowed to a hush, and then slowed to a hush. In the days that followed, something surprising happened. The betrayal that had split us also opened a new avenue for intimacy. We went to counseling and learned that secrets often serve as shields for shame. Once we took the shame into light, it lost some of its power. Ella spoke about why she had kept the secret: fear of disappointing me, fear of losing my trust, fear that a single night could undo a lifetime. She showed me the letter she'd written that night in Vegas and let me keep it. It was a painful act of trust. Tyler, removed now from the immediate crisis but not from our lives, apologized for the way he'd sprung the text on me. He explained that he had been motivated by a complicated mixture of fear and a protective instinct, and his apology was both sincere and messy. I forgave him for the method, if not entirely for the breach. He had forced my hand, yes, but he also freed me from entering marriage with my eyes closed. Claire became, oddly, the glue that kept us honest. Her initial concealment had been a mistake, but her insistence on standing by Ella through the fallout was the kind of loyalty that held when things got hard. Our social circle realigned. Some people took sides, others simply mirrored the awkwardness of living through someone else's truth. But for the first time in months, our conversations were not ship-shape rehearsals. They were rough and open. Over time, the edge of the scandal dulled. The story of Vegas, once the epicenter of our crisis, became an uncomfortable anecdote that people mentioned with the same hurried sympathy they reserve for weather disasters. We rebuilt carefully. Marriage counseling revealed that trust isn't an all-or-nothing thing but a daily practice. Showing up, telling the truth even when it hurts, making small agreements and keeping them. Ella undertook rituals to rebuild trust, total phone transparency for a time, sharing passwords, inviting me to important conversations with friends who were once off limits. I worked on my own capacity to forgive and to accept an imperfect person without equating imperfection with unworthiness. At moments, the resentment flared like acid, and at others, tenderness returned like rescued birds finding their way back to the same branch. People expect dramatic endings to this kind of story: divorce, revenge, scandal, because drama is easy and neat, but real life is stubbornly ordinary. Our days filled with grocery lists, with the way Ella still folded fitted sheets the same way her mother had taught her, with Tyler's terrible attempts at small talk that always made me laugh. The revenge the title promised never came. I suppose the word revenge conjures images of theatrical counters and grand gestures. Our revenge, if there was one, was quieter. It was a refusal to let a single mistake define an entire life. It was choosing to stay and repair rather than to punish. There were setbacks, times when I imagined the anonymous stranger in Vegas and my stomach knotted into the old jealousies, but those images lost power because I had more recent, more vivid memories. The way Ella woke before sunrise to make me coffee for a job interview. The way she kissed my forehead when I was sick, the small domestic betrayals we both committed daily and forgave easily. A year later, we revisited the idea of marriage with different intention. We were honest in the planning, no surprises waiting in the decor or the speeches, and our guest list was smaller, filled with people who had weathered the storm with us. Tyler was there, not as a source of suspicion, but as a man who had done his best in an imperfect moment. Claire stood by Ella steadier now, her presence a reminder that friendship can survive missteps if it's rooted in truth. The ceremony itself was modest. We wrote our own vows, and I admitted in front of our friends that I had once seen love as a perfect line and now saw it as a living thing that required attention. Ella promised she would never hide things that mattered from me again, and I promised to listen without immediate judgment. Oh, after the ceremony, while friends danced and the band played a song that made everyone sway, Tyler pulled me aside and, with the awkwardness of a brother who's seen more than he intended, admitted he had felt guilty for not telling me sooner. "I was scared," he said simply. "I thought I was protecting you both." He didn't excuse himself, but his honesty was a kind of offering. The years that followed were not a clean erasure of the Vegas night, but they were a life built so full of ordinary kindness that the past did not loom as large. We learned slowly and haltingly that secrets have a way of infecting the things you build on top of them. Truth doesn't always come neatly timed, but it is the mortar that holds when storms come. The story changed us. It forced us to negotiate the hard parts of love, the fear, shame, and the human tendency to hide. It showed us that forgiveness is less about forgetting and more about choosing to live with a fuller knowledge of who the other is. As for revenge, people sometimes ask whether I ever wanted to punish Ella or those who had kept truth from me. The honest answer is that I wanted to test the range of my love to see if it would stretch or break. I wanted to know whether the life I had imagined with her was fragile or resilient. In the end, the decision to continue was neither naive nor vengeful. It was pragmatic and brave. We had no illusions about perfection. We had instead a commitment to practice the hard work of intimacy. That practice didn't make the memory vanish, but it made living worthwhile. In quiet moments when the years had softened the edges, we would sometimes laugh at the theatrics of that night. The way a single text could unravel everything and how words like Vegas could sound like thunderclaps. We would remember Tyler's clumsy intervention, Claire's shame, the seamstress's watchful eyes. We would remember the breathless stillness in the bridal suite and the choice we made in the kitchen over 2 plates of cold pasta. But mostly, we would remember the daily acts that telescoped into fidelity. The morning coffee, the shared blankets, the way we learned to argue and then to make amends. The world liked stories with neat endings, and perhaps this one was too ordinary for those who wanted fireworks. But ordinary steady love, the kind that has survived a truth and chosen to keep going, felt like a victory to me. It was not revenge in the cinematic sense. It was a quiet reclamation of life from the wreckage of a mistake, a decision to hold someone and rebuild rather than explode everything in a spectacle of fury. If there was any lesson in the saga of the text, the frozen bride, And the maid of honor who could no longer keep quiet, it was this. Secrets have weight, and the only antidote to the poison they spread is light. Once exposed, secrets either rot or become compost for new growth. We chose growth. We kept the pieces of our story, even the ugly ones, and built from them a life that embraced complexity and, in its imperfect way, felt true. If you ask me now whether I would go back in time and change the path that led me to that midnight text, I'd hesitate. I don't relish the pain we went through, but I am grateful for what it taught me about trust, honesty, and the stubbornness required to love someone who is, inevitably, a collage of their worst night and their best morning. The revenge title makes for clickbait, but the truth is that the only revenge worth pursuing in matters of the heart is the revenge of beauty, of choosing to love in spite of wounds, to make something stronger and kinder from what could have torn you apart.